Welcome to the AIU World Symposium on Innovative Ideas. Today's date is June 29th, 2022. And our next presenter is Dr. Charles Conrick, who has a doctorate in economics from AIU. So he's not here, so we will have a video presentation from Dr. Charles Conrick. And let's go ahead and get that started now.
Today's symposium. Unfortunately, my wife and I are going to be out of town tomorrow. I'm speaking to you on June the 28th, but I'm happy to be here. And the purpose of my discussion is to report on my recent work at Atlantic International University, my findings and some thoughts for the future. And I asked Dr. Lambert to consider presenting the tape at the symposium and inviting your questions to be directed to either my AIU email address or through any other vehicle available to AIU where they could forward me the questions, and I'd be happy to follow up by reading through the questions if there are any at the end of the presentation, and or to attend a future symposia and make sure that I can attend live, as it were. So without further ado, I'm going to minimize my, as you can see, I'm not a average age student. I'll be 70 years old in just a couple of months. Briefly, my own background is I'm a retired college professor in the fields of finance. I came to AIU to seek a PhD in economics, which is my second love. And so I did over the past 2.5 years. I've been working on my coursework, and then recently I was able to successfully defend my thesis. I'm going to give you some of the findings, some of my thoughts. I would ask up front for your patience with any of off-the-cuff remarks that I might make that I hope would not seem in any way offensive, but I'm going to report on facts as I see them. So with that in mind, let me get started, and it's a pleasure to meet you, and I'm going to shrink myself down, as it were, into the lower box of the camera and get right to my work, which is today's symposium. So I just put up a little cover sheet for the symposium. As I remember, today is June the 29th. It's actually June the 28th for me, but the date of the symposium is tomorrow. So that's my little cover sheet. And the purpose of my thesis, and you'll probably notice I do a lot of scratching of my head when I'm recording. I think that's to try to refresh the memory, get the brains moving again. This is what I did my study on, the nation's economic systems in all. I tried to look at a lot of different nations, and the efficiency of production and performance in nations worldwide, and then the fairness of wealth distribution and elimination of poverty. These are the United Nations topics 1 and 2, which means no poverty and zero hunger. And it probably covers several more as well, in addition. But the United Nations number 1 and number 2 goals are to eliminate poverty and then to eliminate hunger. Now, these are very noble goals, but we have to look as economists at this very, very critically. In number 1, can we accomplish such a thing? And number 2, what are the alternatives? So that's what I went into in my thesis. So the first part of my discussion here will be strictly on talking about, well, what did I find out? So if you'll join me on this tour, we'll get there. Definition of economics is basically the study of allocation of scarce resources to unlimited wants. Naturally, since we all live, approximately 8 billion people on one rather small planet in one rather normal-sized galaxy. I mean, this just gets mind-bending. It goes to say that, well, our resources, and it used to be thought, and perhaps it's still true, that most of our resources come from Mother Earth, and of course from our parent star, the sun. So there's only so many things that can be given to people of any kind. And I like to say, as we move down this funnel, I found the 3-point quote you see at the bottom of this this slide. It really can be boiled down to, well, mankind, humankind, has to decide, answer the questions of what to produce, how to produce it, and who gets what. That's economics in a nutshell. Back with all the formal definitions, that's it. You know, if we're on an island, several of us or 100 of us, we're going to have to figure out, well, what are we going to do? We need food to eat, and going according to the great psychologist Abraham Maslow, the Maslow's hierarchy, we have food at the bottom, food and shelter, and then we progress up the ladder till finally, once we achieve one need at a time, we can move up to higher needs like love and family connections, and up to education perhaps, and, you know, self-realization and so on and so forth. But it's only until we solve the bottom set of needs, which is food and shelter essentially, safety, that we can actually move up to the next step. So that would be what to produce, and then how do we best produce it? What's mankind, humankind, whatever the correct wording is, will always be looking for, well, how can we produce the most with the least amount of effort? Which only makes sense. That's common sense. Why would it make sense to any human being, to any thinking creature, to say, let's see if we can produce less and work harder? That is absolutely nonsense. So intuitively or axiomatically, it goes without saying that, well, what's the best way to do this? And number 3, we arrive at the conclusion, and I'll give you just a quick heads up. Really, that's kind of what I found in my in all my research, is that economics as a study, as a science, has really dismally failed at defining, well, who gets what. The market system, kind of going off the script here, the market system says, well, he or she who earns the most has the most money, if it, as you were, and therefore they have the most money to spend, so they get to afford to buy what they want. Socialists would come along and say, well, that's not fair. Markets can be incredibly efficient at setting price for rationing purposes, you know, price being a system of rationing, but it's not fair because rich people get too much and poor people get too little. So a pure communist Marxist thought would say that, well, wait a minute, actually capitalism doesn't really even completely solve the what to produce, because, excuse me, the how to produce question, because of the failures inherent in capitalism, and that it's going to lead to class struggles. Eventually, the workers are going to get tired of working for the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, the landowners, and so on and so forth, and eventually they're going to rebel. And Marx foresaw that there would eventually be a classless society, and that finally mankind would arrive at a situation where we would all basically get along and figure out, well, what's the best way of solving who gets what. I could tell Karl Marx right now to his face, if he were alive, or if I join him in the afterlife, I could tell him right now, well, that's not going to work, because human beings, since Marx's time, sociologically, psychologically, human beings simply don't function like that, at least not in the majority. The basic rationale of all economists is that human beings operate, number one, in their own self-interest, regardless of their behaviors. When I say that, I mean the greedy miser, the corrupt politician, you name it, are acting in a way that maximizes what they consider to be their best interest. Now, it may not be in society's interest. It probably is not. Number two is, going on with that, let's go right to a wonderful person, Mother Teresa, who worked in India, doing nothing but helping poor people in the nation of India, and in fact is a saint in the Catholic Church. Now, most people would say, now see, there's a person that did not act in their best interest. And I would answer, in my opinion, oh yes, they did. Mother Teresa obviously firmly believed in her reward with Christ in heaven. Therefore, it was in her best interest to do his will on earth. And she served her best interest by doing his will. Now, this is a debate. Many of you, or some of you, are perhaps arguing right off the bat. No, that's not true. My mother was the dearest person that ever lived and did everything for me. I would agree 100% that some people are definitely kinder than others, and so on and so forth. That is not my point. My point goes, and I challenge you to think this way. My point gets to be is that ultimately we ourselves are going to operate in the interest that as we see fit, according to the reward that we get from it. The reward might be heaven. The reward might be owning more motorboats. The reward might be more money. But ultimately, we're going to function according to what we operate with. Now, one would think that a rational society, a rational group of individuals could come to terms and say, well, wait a minute, I can't have everything. That's not right. That's not fair. And a man, woman of good moral conscience, which is innate to most human beings. Most of the time, we know right from wrong. We can observe it even from nature. Right from wrong is instilled in many of us. Is it right to steal somebody's other goods? I suppose in some cases it perhaps is, but in most cases it's my belief, my observation that stealing, we know stealing is not correct. I didn't earn it. I didn't do the work, whatever it might be. So I'm getting a little far adrift as usual. That's the curse of being a retired college professor. So you'll allow me to get back onto it. So my interest was on why can't societies focus more on the who gets what question. Now, I wrote in the thesis that up until the Industrial Revolution coming around in about the 17th century, 1600s and into the 1700s.
Hello, please, I can't hear you. There's no sound.
Ruled by monarchies.
Dr. Lambert, please, there's no sound.
In other words, you had a
I
king,
don't know
or you
if
had a
anyone,
queen, or a warlord, or something. There was a boss, an autocrat, perhaps a group of bosses, oligarchs. But there was really no economic thinking other than hunting and gathering or farming and so on and so forth, and war or conquering as Roman Empire. There had been thoughts on economics going back to the Greeks, but until Adam Smith in 1776, there really wasn't a science, so-called, or a study of economics. So Adam Smith, after much thinking, a professor at the University of Glasgow in Scotland, derived capitalism. Now, I don't have time in this little presentation to get into all of the the work that I did on the thesis that perhaps you have done in your studies in economics, but suffice to say that capitalism relies on the market system to solve the three questions: what to produce, how to produce it, and who gets what. In the 1800s, after capitalism had been adopted by England, France, certainly the United States, a brand new country in 1776, adopted capitalism, if at least in its greatest form. A man or a woman owned his or her land. The government pretty much left them alone, and people did what they wanted to and traded in a so-called open market. You know, most people don't even know that Wall Street started back at the time of the Revolutionary War. The markets were already trading on Wall Street way back in the 1770s. But some great thinkers came along, and there have been many. I tend to focus on John Stuart Mill, the great English philosopher, but there's Ricardo, there's numerous socialists. Socialists basically talk about the fact that, wait a minute, we need to have conscience in mind, we need to think deeper. Therefore, in effect, socialism with its, I call it many shades of gray, is some government form of control or ownership of the factors of production, which are generally recognized to be land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. And capital meaning both money, financial assets of any kind, and capital assets, machines, factory buildings, things of that nature. But socialism tends to say, well, unfettered capitalism, capitalism left alone, will run amok. In other words, some people will get very, very rich and many will be very, very poor. Socialism wants to have a central body, usually government, play a form. And this could be in any number of different variations. Karl Marx, we just talked about with the concept of communism, was the elimination of the capitalist system, and really communism is effectively 100% socialism, if you will. I don't think Marx really foresaw strictly government control, but he saw a consortium of peoples and groups that would come together in their various, like a 100% trade union movement, where everything would be fairly discussed. It's almost like reading Plato's Utopia or St. Thomas More's Utopia. It's too much to ask, and the two examples of it that have taken place since Marx did his work occurred. He expected it to occur in England, the communist revolution. Instead, it took place in Russia, as you may know, in 1917 with the overthrow of the Tsars, the Tsarist revolution. But was Marxism really practiced under Joseph Stalin after Lenin died? I would argue, no, not really. You had central planning, that's for sure, government central planning. But was it for the good of the people when so many millions were killed? I don't know. And then, of course, Mao Zedong in China, after winning a civil war with Chiang Kai-shek of the Nationalist Party, which was kind of a very corrupt form of democracy, so to speak. But Mao Zedong started out with again, more purging, and if nothing else, Mao Zedong's strategy of collective farming and agriculture did absolutely nothing for the Chinese economy. And I would argue until Deng Xiaoping came into power in the late 1970s and began to open some of China's systems to market-oriented features. Instead of the farmers all producing for the government, the farmers had a quota to produce so much for government, and then they could sell on open markets what their excess was. Well, then agriculture boomed. The same thing has happened with the direction towards industrialization in China during the 1980s and 1990s and on up until present. In fact, like that time is called the Walmart Revolution because effectively China became such a huge exporter in the 1990s after not being a huge exporter. And America, the United States primarily, became probably its greatest importer. So therefore, Walmart serving as the vehicle, the store by which the Chinese goods would come into American markets via Walmart and other stores and retailers such as Amazon, whatever, and then the Americans got the benefit of very, very cheap goods from 1990 until now. We're still getting. Meanwhile, the Chinese accepted American currency and American debt. Subsequently, the United States has gone from being the largest exporter in 1945 to 1950 to being the largest importer in the past 70 years since the end of World War II. At any rate, on we go. China is not a purely communist system. That's all I'm trying to point out. Now, the phases of economic development, effectively, any nation has these three choices, and you could argue that there's a lot of different types of things, but these are, I tried to hone in on, well, how can I classify these into a taxonomy? And you have really agricultural, crop-based. I mean, a nation has what? Natural resources, which would be its land and its people. And the land can have, of course, many things such as minerals, precious metals, you name it, trees, you name it. But mankind, womankind, humankind first starts out with getting into, well, all right, what can we do with this land? And what can we do with the labor force that we have? Well, the first step would be probably either just selling what you got on the land, be it minerals, be it diamonds, be it gold, it makes no difference. If you can sell it to somebody that's willing to give you something of value, then the nation can do it. But if you want to work your land, if you want something to sell, then you're going to need to establish an agricultural base. You're not just going to skip the step, probably, and go right to mass industrialization, which means you're going to need a lot of capital assets, such as factories, machinery, trained workers, and so on and so forth. And now we've moved up since the computer revolution, which started when I was a young man in the 1970s, or even beforehand, really. But it really took off in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, of course. High tech, which would be information, biotech, robotics, aerospace, and I throw in my field, finance, because finance has grown enormously high tech. Regardless, not only am I talking about cryptocurrency, but I'm talking about the amount of assets and types of financial assets that have been created effectively since 1972, when Fisher Black and Myron Scholes solved what was found to be a fair pricing system for options. The famous Black-Scholes model, a series of partial differential equations which allowed for a relatively decent price on what is something worth in the future, given that we know certain parameters today. Now, in my particular, and this is where we're going to get right to I'm already using more time than I wanted to, but we'll get there. We're going to be looking at GDP per capita. Please look to the bottom of the screen. We're going to be looking at GDP per capita, gross domestic product, which is defined as a nation's total, basically, output, which, if there are no exports and imports, would mean output would be basically sold to the people. So that it would be outputs and inputs. It's your total production. And per capita would mean, well, what's your population? We'll divide the GDP per capita to get an indicator of how efficient and how rich your nation is. Then in 1912, an Italian economist named Corrado Gini came up with this idea, and I had heard of this many times, but I never really researched it. But the Genie score is an extremely useful and very easy to understand descriptor of a nation's wealth distribution. That's just what I wanted. You know, what is a nation doing insofar as its Genie score? Now, with that in mind, let me show you. First of all, let me show you the Genie score, and we'll come back to this. The Genie score. Here's a little Excel spreadsheet that I created strictly for my hypothesis. The Genie score effectively is right here in the light brownish color. That is the Genie score for a wealth distribution of 100 different percentiles. So if we said over here in the far left, where I'm kind of shadowing the screen, if I said, well, the poorest person in our country makes $10,000, and if I said the next 1% or percentile of people average 10,350, and if I kept that up at a constant rate of 3.5% for each percentile, until finally I would get to the 100th or the final or top percentile, what I would find is that if the percent increase over each one of the percentiles was 3.5% per times. Now let me get you dizzy here by rolling down to the 100th percentile, the top percentile. That means the top 1% of our economy would be making $311,914 annually, approximately. No, exactly. And the total, if you notice, the total of the percentiles would be 8,938,000. So if we were able to structure economies that easily, we would find out that, hey, that gives us a pretty good descriptor of what our who gets what situation looks like. Well, you'll notice that I put high to low. That means that top, the people earning 301,000 are earning per year 30 times more than those in the bottom percentile, or those that are earning 10,000, our poorest people. The median 50th percentile, our 50th percentile are earning 5.5 times our lowest percentile. And high to median, which means our top earners, the top 1%, are earning 6 times what our median is earning. Of more import to you would be, well, what is the Genie score? And you can see in this case it's 0.48. 0.48. Now the question I would ask you is that fair? That happens to be the Genie score of the United States. I'm not going to get into the details of exactly how it's computed, but I'm just going to show you how it works. That is the Genie score of the United States. Now, is that fair? I don't think so. My decision is somewhat subjective. According to a capitalist system, hey, Katie bar the door. But in my opinion, we have far too many people that are rich, and not enough people that are making. We have too many people that are poor, I should say, and not enough that are making a decent income. So what if I wanted to lower this Genie? Well, clearly you can intuitively assume, well, I've got to lower that percentage increase. Well, what if I dropped it to 2.5 instead of 3.5? Well, that made a difference. If you look, you see the Genie score dropped to 0.37, which, by the way, is considered relatively good. The highest earners earn about 11 times what the lowest do. The median earns about 3.3 times what the lowest do, and the highest earn about 3.5 times what the median earn on an annual basis. So looking at the sheer numbers, again, keeping our lowest percentile in whatever form they get income, either through transfers or work or what have you, they're making $10,000 a year. The top, at the very top, we've got people making $118,000. And that, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, from 0.3 to about 0.35, 0.38 is considered a pretty decent Gini score. Anything below 0.30 is considered very fair. Now, what would have to happen for that? Well, clearly you can see we'd have to go down to about a 1.5% spread. So there you can see that the Gini score has dropped to 0.23. Our highest earners make only 4.4 more. So clearly that's going to take 10,000, multiply it by 4.3. You're going to have about $44,000 at the highest. Let's check our 100th percentile. And sure enough, that's what it is, 44,320. The top 1% in this mythical society earn only 4.37. From medium to low is 2, and the high to median is also about 2. And we've got a Gini score of 0.23. Does that seem fair? Well, according to the Gini score, that's considered to be a very equitable distribution, so a target worth looking at. Now, let's look at another example. What if we raise this 1.5% up to 4.5%? Now you'll see the Gini score has gone up to 0.57, which, by the way, anything over 0.50, anything over 50, is considered to be a very, very unequal society. So the United States is on the brink at 0.48. And here you can almost see it. Look at that. The high is earning 78 times that of, in this mythical society, the high income earners earning 78 times more than the lowest income earner. From the median to the low is only 8.6 times, and from the high to the median is 9 times. So what is 78 times 10? It's going to be a lot of money, ain't it? In this case, it comes out at about $815,000 annually. So can you imagine a society where, that had a Gini score of 0.57? What it implies, even not assuming a constant percentile growth, you might be asking, well, is it possible that any country could have this exact a spread? Probably not. We could solve for that by putting in random numbers between each percentile, and we would still derive the same type of conclusions, but we might find out that the percentile spread from 1 to 50 is only 1%, and then from 50 to 90 is 3%, and then from 90 to 100 is 6%. In other words, it's not constant. I did this just to show you the Gini scores. So for the rest of my discussion, please keep in mind that this spreadsheet is simplified simply to show you that the effect of the Gini score, 50 or over is considered unequal, 40 to 50 is considered borderline unequal, 30 to 40 is considered relatively good, and anything below 30, in other words, in the 20s, is considered, hey, it's good. You might ask, well, what if there was no increase? And then what would the Gini score be? Well, guess what? It's rounded here, but it would simply be 1, or 0 rather. The Gini score would be 1. Everybody in our society makes $10,000 a year, so there's no increase. If I put in here a very small number like 0.01, you can see, well, even that, it's still going to give you a score of basically 0. The Gini score is being rounded off. Hopefully you get the idea. Okay, so now I want to in that case, take a look at some of the data that I found. And here's an Excel spreadsheet that helped me to feed all this. I gathered an enormous amount of data from the United States Central Intelligence Agency World Handbook, from from the Heritage Foundation, from the World Bank, from Credit Suisse, puts out a great amount of information. I can't speak for the accuracy of the information of the data. This data is all from 2021, so it's only about a year old. But let's focus on the Genie score and the GDP per capita in all these nations. And what I found was that, you might notice, let's take a couple of familiar countries. The United States, my country, has a GDP per capita of about $65,000. But notice my Genie score is shown at 41. Well, the 2020, this is 2020 data. I beg your pardon. The 2021 Genie score for the United States was 48, as I mentioned earlier. Nevertheless, I wanted to imply to you that 41%, a Genie score of 41% in the United States with that high of a GDP per capita is really not really bad. So if we sort this by the Gini, say from smallest to largest, with smallest being the best, which I already explained to you, the lowest country in the world is Slovenia at 24. Their Gini score is very low, and that's what I found out. I was able to talk about that in the thesis, is that Europe seemed to account for most of the low Gini scores, implying that Europe probably has the best distribution of income as measured by the Gini score. So if we went over, we could sort this by even, let's say we took just the European area and looked at just Europe and looked at the subtotals down at the bottom. You can see the Gini score came out as an average of 31 in the European nation, with a GDP per capita of about 40,000. Now you might be asking, well, what's a good GDP per capita? A good GDP per capita on this database is only, is from 0 to 20 is low. From 20 to 20 to about 40 is actually quite good. I would call it lower middle income. From 40 to 60 is upper middle income, and anything above 60 is high GDP per capita. Now, this is not just the rich nations, but it would mean, okay, well, it would mean that these nations are at least they've got somewhat, they have somewhat, that's the word I'm looking for, very productive, and appears to be doing fairly well. So if, for example, we sorted this by largest to smallest, I don't even pay much attention to a country like Luxembourg. It's just a tiny little country with 600,000 people, and they're probably doing, Ireland shocked me. Ireland shocked me, with 5 million people at that high of a GDP per capita. Switzerland, great banking area, but Norway, Iceland, Denmark, Netherlands, Austria, these are all very, very good GDPs per capita. So it means they're producing in good order. They're not in the highest category, but they're doing quite well. And the average, or let's look at the lowest. The lowest I found were mostly in Eastern Europe, which would be probably a function of the Soviet experiment, I would think. You can take just a quick look. I obviously have this data. My thesis has all this data sorted on it, and AIU it's welcome to distribute the thesis to the symposium attendees if it wishes to. I'm happy to do that as just a courtesy, and then you can see what the findings of my data were. I simply don't have time to explore it all here. What concerned me, kind of bring it down to what concerned me was when I looked at the sub-Saharan African nations, and I looked at GDP per capita, and I looked at, let's say, sorted from largest to smallest. It has a few nations that are doing all right, including the Seychelles Islands, Mauritius, Botswana. When I say all right, I mean sub-Saharan Africa has been a continent that has been kind of isolationist its whole history, and also taken advantage of by, first of all, the European powers, then the North America, United States did its share of taking off resources, and now the Chinese are over there, supposedly investing, all these nations, supposedly we're investing to help sub-Saharan Africa. I'm not seeing where the help is going and coming from. I think that most of these political peoples, regardless of their national, regardless if it's the United States, regardless if it's the Europeans, or regardless if it's the Chinese, you remember what I said at the beginning? Self-interest dominates. So one must constantly keep that in mind, as hard as it may seem. But I was disappointed in this, obviously, in that, you know, it's the lowest I found was Burundi with a GDP per capita of 783. And the Genie scores, if you look at the average Genie score was over 40, which is not great. Now, it's hard to tell things from averages. You can drown in a river that's only an inch deep, but God help you if it's got the middle couple of feet or 10 feet deep and you fall into it. So you can drown in a river an inch deep. So statistics are not all telling. That's not my purpose here. But the point gets to be is that there are certain areas that we can focus on as being either poor or rich. For example, if we look at the Americas only and not sub-Saharan Africa, and then sort from highest to lowest on GDP per capita, we'll find the United States and Canada, with the United States well ahead, much bigger population, but a higher Gini score. Canada appears to be distributing its wealth and income more fairly. Here's Canada. After that, we tend to go down the ladder pretty quickly, particularly in South America. I just heard this morning's news that Brazil, which is a large nation population-wise, 211 million people, really should be being courted, if you will, by the United States more. Brazil is such a large nation, as is Mexico. You can see Mexico, Mexico 127 million with a GDP per capita of 20,000, although I doubt if that includes the cartel scores. Income Gini, not too bad in Mexico, but again, I doubt if that includes the cartel scores. But a lot of the Americas are fairly poor. All right, so the data, of course, we can just keep reporting on and reporting on and reporting on. And I'm not sure that we're going to get to the essence of the alternatives for the future. And I'm running out of some time here already. Let me discuss that a little bit by looking at a map of the world. And I'm using Google Maps here, obviously. And I'm just starting out. And in my thesis, you can read, by the way, the little blue dot is where I'm located, in Southwest Florida. The little blue dot indicates where I'm at. I said that already. Obviously, Canada's up here just to acclimate. There's the States, Central America, South America down here. And if we go around the world, always amazes me when I study history and I look at the United Kingdom and Germany. Oh, I don't want to look up little pop-ups. This little area here of Western Europe back in the 1700s was doing most of the exploring of the entire world. China and Japan, although they had somewhat advanced, they had, and all these areas had somewhat advanced societies, but they weren't explorers, at least not in the time frame that I'm talking about. It's rumored that the Chinese were sailing around the world 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. I'm not familiar with the history of that. It's quite possible. But in the recent past, being the last couple of hundred years, this little area here tended to dominate. And what I pointed out in my thesis is that it was only after the sociological and political aspects that allowed the United States to be ready at the time to take on a very powerful enemy in Germany, along with the United Kingdom and Russia, and also to fight a war against a very powerful enemy in Japan. Here's Hawaii down here. I mean, the first war that was entirely fought over the world. And that's what led the United States to, in my opinion, more so than any other factor, not economic choice, nothing, but the fact that we were isolated by the two oceans from all this fighting, and we were able to come in and help. Now, what stopped South America, from developing? It's obviously as big as North America. Argentina is rumored to me to have just about the same landmass as the United States, or close to it, and has great farming and ranching. Well, what stopped Argentina? Sub-Saharan Africa, when we look at that, of course, when we're looking at such nations that are all covered, as indicated, by desert near the equator, and then we come to South Africa, or Southern Africa, where we have all these small nations. For whatever reason, they decided to. Frankly, I'm not familiar to know the reasons of the decision that these nations stayed primarily with their tribal roots. I don't know the answer to the question, so you'll have to forgive me. But nevertheless, few of them have emerged as major industrial powers. The same thing was true of course, India and China. Until recently, China has begun, as I mentioned, recently, being the 1980s, 1990s, to become an industrial powerhouse. And of course, Japan has always been an interesting country to me, and that with such little landmass, and yet because of evidently their cultural background, their stick-to-itiveness, their loyalties to family, whatever it is that allowed them to become such a powerful nation by the 1930s, it's incredible to me. Russia, simply too big to govern. So too big to govern. My God in heaven. I can't even find it half the time. Here's Moscow way over here, and they're controlling all the way over to Vladivostok, someplace over in here. Holy Toledo. This is a country that is populated where? Just in the area around Moscow and west. And Vladimir Putin has said that, well, I need more land, therefore I'm going to take Ukraine. All right. Let me conclude in the next few minutes by saying this. What are the alternatives for the future? First of all, there's going to be people like me, and I hope you students, I don't probably have enough time, that are going to be working on this situation. The reason I've saved the world map for the end is that clearly we still have a lot of global problems. I'm not sure that Europe's welfare states, since the end of World War II, Europe has created really Western Europe's created a group of welfare states. Yet Germany is still a large exporter. England is still a large banking sector. Austria is doing well. Switzerland, a large banking sector. The nations of the Scandinavia, up in here, Sweden, Finland, Norway, and Denmark are all doing rather well insofar as income and income distribution. They're models to look at. The United States is right now, in my opinion, facing a crossroads, much as it did in the Civil War of 1861 to 1865. The United States is very deeply divided between very liberal thought and conservative thought, for lack of a better term. The United States is going to have to make up its mind on, all right, what part are we going to play in the global future? I think this is going to happen regionally. I told Dr. Lambert I would offer some thoughts on this. I think the future is going to change dramatically from what we know now. I think it's incumbent upon all of us to say, well, let's look at a United Nations that has some teeth. The United Nations, when it was founded back in, I'll put myself from my clothes in full screen here. When the United Nations was founded in 1945, it's highly unfortunate that the five powers, the United States, Britain, France, Russia, and China, kept full control, veto control of the Security Council. One step will be for the United Nations to gather teeth. Now, how all the smaller nations are going to start finally telling the bigger nations what to do and how to do it, I haven't worked that out yet. I'm not sure that's even possible. But the United Nations definitely needs some teeth. It's going to take rational people, a lot of rational talk, and a lot of rational discussion. We're going to have to attempt to eliminate much of the corruption that's in this world. Now, that's really pie in the sky talking. From a 70-year-old man, I'm supposed to be talking like it just ain't going to happen. It may not. But you students, and even those of you that, I don't know if any of you are my age, but if you are, maybe you think I'm talking like a total idealistic young kid. But no, I see no end to this. The suffering that's going on in Ukraine and the problem with the so-called war. Personally, I think the West should have just told Vladimir Putin that, no, if you're going to do this, you're going to have to deal with all this. They're supposedly meeting now, the G7 is meeting now to put more economic sanctions. Well, Putin and China are working together. It seems like all these world leaders always want what they call hegemony, which is world power. The United Nations must grow. And soon. And soon. It can't be just the United States anymore. It can't just be Germany. It can't be just China. Are we going to separate into regions? The Americas, the Europeans, the Africans, the Russians, the Asians, and live peacefully together? You students have no choice. The work you're doing and the work the United Nations does, little by little, is a great help. However, the answer has also got to come from we economists. What is a fair way? Capitalism is a wonderful way of organizing productive forces because, according to the rational theory of self-interest, the person that develops the tools, that develops the inventions, wants to be rewarded. He's entitled to it. The persons that do the work of the people that invent everything, as they do the work, I would think they would be more than happy to share, to let the so-called inventor and whatever have more of the wealth, as long as they got a part of the wealth themselves. So what I call for is that, and I'm going to use my own country as a base, what we must do is say, what is the minimum established pay that would allow an individual family or person, whatever, but I'll use the family, to have decent housing, decent food and decent medical care. What is the average income? And they must be guaranteed a job. This goes back to the work of great benefactor Hyman Minsky. You might want to look that name up if it interests you. And Hyman Minsky said the government could serve as employer of last resort. That's much like what Franklin Delano Roosevelt did in World War II. Now, that said, that doesn't mean these people can just slough off and do nothing. We can no longer simply have transfer payments to people that do nothing to serve society. Now, I'm not talking about the retired or the indigent or the people that are, the indigent, perhaps, if they're not working and they just want to sit on the sidewalk and beg, then that's their business. But if they're able-bodied and they can work, then government can do the work. There's plenty of places in Chicago, in the United States and my hometown, Chicago, that need painting, that need cleaning. There are plenty of elderly people that need help with groceries. And instead of everybody running around shooting one another, wouldn't it be smarter if they were running around helping each other? Now, that's going to be my first effort, is to be looking into those areas, and then how can we fairly compensate those in the middle and upper end? I'm going to work, as I told Dr. Lambert, on the solution to who gets what. I think economics, in whatever way they want to, have already solved what to produce and how to produce. But who gets what? Just because Jeff Bezos invented Amazon, to me, I can't understand why now he can shoot himself into space. Who cares that he's going into space, really? All right, I've run out myself out of time. I'm sorry. I hope I've given you some food for thought. And if nothing else, I could have talked for another 2 hours. But I've certainly enjoyed this being at your symposium, and I hope you've gained some information. Have a good day.
Okay, we want to thank Dr. Charles Conrick for his presentation on economics, looking at the history of the world, different ways of doing things, inequality, and realizing there are better ways to support entrepreneurs in society, people who are able to work, people who have the mind to be part of the system of the economy. So I'm going to be putting a link into chat right now.
Doctor,
on
disculpe,
courses.
soy de Perú y no sé mucho inglés, por favor.
I'm going to be putting a link. I put in chat a file of links of exams for entrepreneurship. So if you want to go ahead and download that file, and it'll give links, and those exams will train you to be an entrepreneur, to understand international entrepreneurship, things you need to do, pricing, organizational development. These exams will train you to be an entrepreneur. So you can choose whatever exam you want, but you also get a great book with those exams. All right. So thank you for Dr. Charles Conrick. We will now move on to our next presentation. 1 second.